Welcome back to the iTDi Gallery Teachers Summer Intensive course for English teachers all over the world. We're very happy to have you with us. We're very happy, Divya, to have you with us for this session. We got some beautiful slides. We got some real work to do. It's a wonderful day. And I don't know why, but this room is called Real Divya. Here she comes. Coming up. Judy is here. That's okay, Brian. We missed you, but we're very happy you're here. Cheryl, we're glad you're back. Okay, I'm going to pop out and turn it over. So thank you.
And thanks to all of you watching the recording if you couldn't be here, and welcome, Divya.
There we go. We're in the background in case you need us.
Is it me
Just
now?
yell.
All right. All right. Okay.
Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in this session on action research. It's the very first time I've danced my way into a webinar on research, and I hope it won't be the last. I hope you've been enjoying this amazing open access summer intensive so far. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Chuck and Barbara and Jason for all their very hard work in making this happen, and more importantly, in making it free and available to everyone online. I think a lot of energy and resource has gone into this, and I think they deserve a big round of applause if one can give that on a webinar. So, and we also need so many more institutions to follow in these footsteps, I think, of making things more open access and more freely available. Access is going to be something that I talk about quite a bit, because I'm going to talk today about research and the things that divide research and practice, and I'm going to talk specifically about action research in all of this. So let's do it. Let's talk about action research. If you decide to tweet things from this webinar, could you please use the iTDi AR hashtag? Chuck, maybe you could put it in the chat box. So whenever I talk about research, I try to bridge the gap between academia and professional practice, and especially when it comes to classrooms. And the reason I keep making this link is because we very often look at research as something outside our practice. It's over there among the researchers, among the academics, among the PhD holders. And I wrote a blog post about this about 2 years ago called Research Says, and where I criticized this particular kind of blind authority. And I've had lots of conversations that have stemmed from this post, and it sort of affirmed a lot of my thoughts around the fact that research needs to be less divided between those who can and those who don't have access to all the firewalled content and the keep using sound, to all the firewalled content and to all the halls of academic fame that not every one of us are a part of. Are we okay with sound? I'm seeing people in the chat box have sound issues, because I had sound issues earlier. Should I keep going, Jason? Is everything all right? Okay.
Divya, I think the best thing for you to do is just to leave and come back with the same
link.
Okay,
I can do that.
That often just takes care of it.
Okay.
Let's try that first. Maybe we can throw a question out there for folks about AR.
Okay.
Let's get them
back in a second.
Question, and then you can go out.
All right then. Well, I'll just.
So to you teachers out there, what do you know about action research? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Cycles. Ooh, cyclical. And to someone who has no idea what action research is at all, how can you explain that cyclical nature? What problems we're going to study? No idea. That's the best one because you're going to get a really wonderful presentation on it. Problematization. That's a fantabulous word. How to collect data and so much more. Reflection. Yeah, great. All of these together really. Yeah, the cyclical nature, the exploratory nature, the working through problems, addressing and working through problems. Puzzle treatment analysis. Cool. Living, yeah, it's living research.
You're doing a great job there, Jason. I've just been watching for
Yeah.
Divya
No,
to come
just
back, and
figured.
she is back.
Okay.
There
Sorry,
she is.
guys.
There we go.
I'm using another
No
browser in
worries
the
at
hope that
all.
this will.
Much better.
Are we okay? Tyson, you took my word. That's 3 slides away. I left the room for 3 minutes. Okay. Okay. My goodness, people have been saying so many things. Let me just scroll back. Okay. All right. As I was saying, I think research is sometimes represented as a blind authority, and this is one of the things I try to overcome in how I talk about research and how I sort of engage non-researchers to engage, encourage non-researchers to engage with research. Because I think that once you step beyond the research corridors and the academic institutions, in the real world, we tend to engage with research as second or third or fourth generation knowledge. We read a study, maybe, or more likely, we read a report of a study in a newspaper or somewhere like that, or we hear a spoken account of a report of a study, or even better and even more commonly, I think, an overheard spoken account of a report of a study. You know, the information just gets filtered down when it comes to research, but suddenly when the word research comes up, we transform it into this sort of super statement that instantly passes judgment on the environment that we're in. And this carries so much weight. The word research carries so much weight because it's usually followed by some sort of irrefutable statement that uses very formal academic language. And I think it's important to admit how alienating this can be to the proper growth of knowledge, which is why, you know, we're all here and why we all work in education. So I think research is used as a power tool, and I think we need more and more attempts at understanding how to use it as a powerful tool. I had to send Chuck my slides again yesterday because on Tuesday I saw this article in the Washington Post that illustrated so nicely what I'm talking about here. Study, billions of dollars in annual teacher training is largely wasted. Now, this is such a strong statement. And when you actually read the article, they talk about the fact that there were 3 schools involved in this study, and that, you know, I mean, you know, they don't actually give details on what sort of training these teachers received, but it just says that billions of dollars were wasted. Now, I know many people who could do an awful lot for teacher training with $1 billion, and I can tell you it won't be wasted. So, you know, I think this is precisely why the word research says can be used in this sort of, you know, so all powerful, all-encompassing manner, and it needs a little bit of unpacking and a little bit of awareness as we approach it. And I also think that so many economists, sociologists, journalists, you know, and politicians put forward their ideas about education with very, very loud voices in very important arenas where they're heard and they're taken seriously. And I think it would be a really good idea if teachers had much more of a voice to share in these arenas, because we're the only ones with that much access to our classrooms, no one else. And we need to start talking about our classrooms, and we need to start researching our classrooms, because we need to play the game of providing sort of accountable and solid information about what we do beyond the sort of simple narrative of what teaching is. So I think research has a very real role to play politically in our sort of educational lives, because we need to get ourselves and get our voices out there. So today I'm going to talk about the specific link between action research and teacher voice. The question I get most regularly when I talk to people about action research is, how do we integrate these lovely ideas of research and reflection and all into real life? Because teachers' real lives are so very messy, aren't they? And I couldn't agree more. I work in an academic environment, but I'm also a language teacher for some of the time. And I have two students of all different levels and who have different stories and needs and abilities. And I deal with the daily realities of English language teaching in a very real sense. So I understand this. So I'm going to try and do one thing in this webinar that might make that messy reality that we all have in our daily lives a little bit easier. Instead of giving you an extensive bibliography with lots of different things to go away and look up, I'm going to use just the one book. And I'm going to refer to it pretty consistently throughout the talk. So if you're inclined to read one book on action research, I would recommend this one. It's about 20 years old. It was published in 1986, and it's called Becoming Critical. And it's written by Wilfred Carr and Stephen Kemmis. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't other incredibly worthwhile sources for action research out there as well, but I'm doing this because I often go to conference talks and I write down all this stuff, and sometimes I even Amazon the books to myself before I've left the conference because I've been so inspired by what people have said. But then the reality of my classes, my students, my marking, my preparation, let alone my family life and children and so on set in, and I feel really frustrated because I don't actually have the time to read. And so I've always felt that it would be great if a conference speaker told me what the best book to read in a certain area was and talked me through it for an hour and let me explore the rest on my own. So that's what I'd like to do today. And I hope you find it useful. Another thing I'll mention before I get started is that I haven't set up polls on purpose because I would like us to interact around the quotes from the book, and I'll leave them up for a little while when I do put them up so that we can have a bit of a conversation about that. Okay, so I'm going to do just that now. I'm going to put up a quote from the book, and I will read it with you and then let you read it for a minute and respond to it. So this quote says, "Some of the knowledge that teachers have, like the notion that classrooms are the appropriate place for education to go on in, has its roots in habit, ritual, precedent, custom, opinion, or mere impressions. Its rationale must first be recovered from assumption before critical work can begin." So I'd like you to think a little bit about the notions around what education is in your context and identify the potential sort of rituals around this notion. There are sort of many ways of approaching this. I think you could look at it from a physical setting in terms of classroom behaviors, in terms of what's expected of people in the sort of discipline of schooling. You could look at it from a materials perspective. You could look at it from a sort of teacher development perspective. I think there are multiple interpretations from this. So as you're chewing on this, could you also chew on the phrase recovered from assumption? Because I think it's a very, very powerful phrase, because so much is lost to assumption, to the idea of taking things for granted. When we see something as a fixed or a given phenomenon, we stop really questioning it. It's just the way things are. And if there's one thing action research does, is it shakes up the way things are. So, yes, there is a lot of information in that quote, I know. Take your time and scribble down some notes. Don't just write in the chat box, because there will be time at the end for us to go through all this. Let's forget what right, okay. Nothing is ever written in stone. Okay, everybody's here with the right attitude, that's for sure. Okay, excellent. I saw this quite strongly in my work this year. This year I was teaching a group of master's students who were going to be future primary school teachers. And I was just teaching one methodology module within their wider MA program. And one of the first tasks they had to do for me was to write a reflective piece of writing, and that described what informed their pedagogical beliefs. So what sort of built their mental framework as a teacher, as it were. And you know, they bear in mind that these people hadn't been teaching yet. They had done like 1 or 2 teaching placements, but they weren't in classrooms on an everyday basis yet. So one of my students wrote a really, really interesting piece, because she described her teaching placement where she went into a school for a day and taught a group of 7-year-olds. And she said that she noticed that she raised her voice very regularly at them, but she didn't do so angrily or, you know, to scold them or anything like that. She found that she raised her voice whenever she felt a little nervous. And she said she had a moment of realization as she was doing that, because she thought, oh my goodness, all those teachers who kept raising their voices at me probably felt really nervous as well. And she used this as the basis of her own research project subsequently, where she talked about the panic buttons that get pushed in teachers, especially in primary environments, which are sort of very demanding environments physically sometimes, because you have a lot of physical discipline and keeping children quiet and getting them to concentrate and all this to do. And she talked about how we have these buttons that are pushed in us, and teachers tend to default into states that they're, you know, comfortable in. And what's comfortable is sometimes simply how we were taught. And so she wrote this fascinating piece of work about how she needed to overcome the comfort state, you know, the sort of default state. And yes, so this is I think one example of, you know, questioning the sort of received knowledge and what is fixed in our minds, and taking it further. But I'll be very happy to read some more of your thoughts later on. So this brings me to the word that Tyson already introduced you all to, which is problematizing. And I think problematizing is one of the very important ways to get into action research. Now, people write chapters in books about problematizing, and lots of academic articles have been written about it, but I'm going to give you a very, very simple 2-tiered definition on problematizing. This is my definition, homemade, on problematizing. It's about asking questions related to our mindsets before asking questions related to our environment. I don't know if you'd agree with me on this one, Tyson. But I think when we ask questions related to our mindsets, we ask ourselves a lot of very deep questions that are related to our history, our education, our cultural responses to our history and our education, our languages, the way we view the world, the way we interact with the world. These are all the things that make up your mindset. Other words I would use for mindset are worldview, and sort of paradigm, really, you know, what you approach the world with, you know, what you bring to the situation. So I think it's very important to ask these questions first, before asking the questions related to the environment, because the questions related to the environment are inevitably structured by our mindsets. We ask different kinds of questions when our mindsets change. So I think this is my sort of definition for problematization, if you want to note it down. And I will come back to this as well at the end of the talk. So this, I think, is a good starting point for change, and perhaps a useful way into critical discourse, because one of the most important, I think problematization is one of those words that sound fancy, and unfortunately is a little bit fancy. Some words sound fancy and don't need to be that fancy, but problematization isn't about problem solving. And this is a distinction that needs to be made, because I think with problem solving, you would do the second stage without necessarily doing the first stage. You would ask questions related to the environment, you have a problem, you look for a solution, and you work towards that with some sort of goals along the way. And critical discourse itself, it's not about simple nuts and bolts problem solving. It's about creating a structure of thinking around an event, around a situation, around a phenomenon that might just raise more questions, that might give way to more theory being generated, that might create some practical solutions. But it's a whole mass of different layers of meaning, I think. So action research is one of the most concrete manifestations of critical pedagogy, because it helps put it into practice quite simply, I think. I see a lot of interesting stuff going on in the chat box, so let me just take a minute. The stage fright, yes, very interesting stage fright. Stay open and avoid assumption. Yeah, I agree with that, Judy, completely, of course. Absolutely, Maria, very good point. I'm going to show you another quote now. Action researchers reject the view that transformations in consciousness are sufficient to produce transformations in reality. Transformations of social reality cannot be achieved without engaging the understandings of social actors involved. So it's slightly more simply, it's not enough to think about something. It's not enough to be conscious of something. It's not even enough to just reflect on something. You have to do something for things to change. And this theme of doing is one that you will see occurring again and again with action research. It's very much a roll up your sleeves and get involved kind of research. So this idea of doing and doing what needs doing is at the heart of pedagogy itself, I think, because what is pedagogy if it isn't essentially about what needs to be done in a given environment with a given set of people? And I think critical pedagogy links these needs to the dynamics of commitment and struggle. So let me give you a little bit of history about action research. Kurt Lewin is the person who coined the term in the 1940s, and he worked on ethnic minority groups in the US and sought ways of improving their social realities. So action research didn't start in education or in classrooms. It started very much in sort of real life outside the classroom. Lewin envisioned a spiral of cycles. If you're taking handwritten notes, draw a little spiral right now so that you can visualize it. A spiral of cycles of research, and with each sort of phase it gets a little bit bigger. So with my limited PowerPoint skills, I've tried to make a spiral here, and there are 4 stages that most action researchers would agree on. You have the planning stage, the initial planning stage, which is right at the center of the slide, and then you act, and then you observe, and then you reflect, and you use this initial first cycle to plan again, and then to act, observe, and reflect, and so on and so forth. And with each cycle, it gets bigger and bigger, but it's all focused around the same central area of research. So I think what's also important to remember is that with this diagram, you can see that it's a highly involved form of research where participant and researcher interact at most stages of the process. But when Lewin started using this form of research, he talks about how it benefits the whole of social research because of this very connected dimension. And so at the time, in the 40s, Lewin laid out 3 layers of definition for action research. The first was that it was participatory in character. It is democratic in its impulse, and it has a simultaneous contribution to social science and social change. So simultaneous contribution to both theory and practice. The most powerful quote I have from Kurt Lewin, which encapsulates everything that his work is about, is this one. Research that simply produces books will not suffice. If you would indulge me with a gap fill activity, I'm going to take a few words out of this sentence and ask you to suggest some of your beliefs, put forward some of your beliefs about research and about the kind of research that we need. So, what do you think? Oh, wonderful, exclusive to the Academy. Brilliant. I see some more responses. Some two-way dialogue. Yes. Can I cut and paste this somewhere? It's very precious. That doesn't involve reflection. That has no practical application. Excellent. It is not based in reality. Oh, wonderful, Alexandra, that only aims to find what it aims to find. Okay. I'll just let Maria finish her thought. That doesn't address real needs. Yeah. So I think everything that you've all suggested here, is done involuntarily. Yes, involuntarily. Very true. That happens a lot, especially with trainee teachers who have to have a research component in their work. That's. I have a funny little story I can tell you here while people write their thoughts. About 3 or 4 years ago, I gave a talk in Istanbul on action research, and there were very few people in the audience because it had a really dry, researchy title. But just at the last minute, a group of 8 students came in and sat right at the front row. So I thought, oh wow, okay, all these very young teacher researchers who want to, yes, it was ISTEC, who want to hear about action research. So I asked them, so do you do research? And they were like, yes, we have to for our XYZ modules of our master's degree. And they said, so why are you interested in action research today? And I kept pressing them for questions of why they were there. And one of them said, look, we're not really here because we're interested in action research. We're here because Jeremy Harm is sitting in the back and we want his autograph. So that was very funny and a very nice little reality check. But yes, those were students who were made to do research and who were there because they had to. Yes. Okay. So what I'd like to do, I'm getting to the main bit of my talk now, is to do exactly what I said I'd do with that problematization slide. And I'd like to problematize research for you a little bit by talking about the different mindsets involved in research. And after this, I'd like to think about your teaching environments and your research environments, and that's hopefully where we can have quite a lot of exchange. So here we go. I'll stay on this slide for a little while, actually, because I'm going to talk through these 3 frames. So there are 3 broad frames of educational theory as is presented in this book. Other academics tend to have other views on this, but I really like the clarity with which Karen Kemmer split this out into the 3 sections. So the first view, the first sort of frame for educational theory is the natural scientific view. This is the one where people are so sort of enamored by things that are scientific and things that are not scientific, and things that are scientific carry such a lot of weight, so much more so that things that are not, that things that are holistic, or all these other words that don't fit into the frame. So The scientific view has its ancestry in 19th century France. It's largely credited to Auguste Comte, who first used the word positivism. And he used it in a social context. And some have argued that he used it in response to the sort of societal malaise that resulted from post-revolution France and the need to converge social discourse in scientific terms that were clear and common to all. So in education, the positivist tradition holds the ideal of a complete and scientific explanation of social reality. Human phenomena is measurable in the same manner that natural phenomena like gravity and light and such are. So positivist thinking is pretty detached, I would say, from the socio-emotional dimension of human experience because it's very concerned with the values of neutrality and unbiasedness. Positivism also echoes a little bit of what happened in the Enlightenment, specifically Descartes and his work, where he talked about our knowledge of our mental events is more certain than any other knowledge. And so in order to count as a mental event, knowledge has to be immediately accessible. And so it's got this sense of information at your fingertips. And we see so many manifestations of this today in the modern world, namely our love affair with big data, and as I said just now, this obsession with things being scientific. It's got this sort of stand back, it's science attitude about it, which really shows the weight of this particular research tradition for us. Scientific methodology casts an objective lens on reality, and the quest for uncovering truth is mainly done in sort of clear, understandable, and generalizable terms. So what is the criteria for good quality in the natural scientific view? It has a sort of empirical license, as I would describe it. It has data that is valid, that is reliable, that is generalizable, and that is replicable. And it seeks to establish common links between the different strands of social phenomena. But this is just one frame and just one way of looking at things. And as you can imagine, not everybody at the time subscribed to this in the 19th century, and even today, not everyone subscribes to it. But why would you research education in this way? The authors ask in the book. Quite simply because it's straightforward and it doesn't confuse subjective perceptions with empirical study. And it seemed to be objective and neutral. So I'll quote directly from the book here. That's why I went off to get my piece of paper earlier, by the way. In short, the role of the teacher is one of passive conformity. And the practical recommendations of educational theorists and researchers is sort of what the teachers conform to. Teachers themselves are not regarded as professionally responsible for making educational decisions and judgments, but only for the efficiency with which they implement the decisions. Governments like numbers and grades. I couldn't agree more. Yes, and not everything in education is measurable. Yes, I realize I'm speaking to the converted here, but So about 100 years after this, we had what we called a social turn in research, and it drew a very clear line between the study of the natural world and the study of the social world, and insisted that the methods we used to understand these two worlds were simply not interchangeable, and so it rejected a lot of the scientific methodology. And again, I'm going to quote a little bit from the book for you. The behavior of human beings consists mainly of their actions, and a distinctive feature of actions is that they are meaningful to those who perform them and become intelligible to others only by reference to the meaning that the individual actor attaches to them. So you see already here that it's a very, very complex layers and layers of meaning. And interpretivists believe in multiple realities, in socially constructed meanings for these realities, and with a greater and greater emphasis on the individual human experience. And so the study of social phenomena as the goal of research is not to generalize, but to understand the process through thick and rich descriptions of it. Thick and rich are the key words here, that you have to describe things in an adequate way for it to have credibility in this sort of research. So interpretivist methodology moves our understanding away from the science of society towards an experience of how human beings live, really. And the lived world is always in the middle of things. There's a phrase that interpretivists use called in media res, in the middle of things. So there's always a before and there's always an after in everything that we study. And it's quite difficult to actually study something in complete isolation of everything else. So what is the criteria for good quality in this sort of research? Well, it's transparency, and it's making appropriate claims and judgments. Transparency mainly involves a lot of detail on how the research was carried out, from decisions regarding data collection and analysis to your sort of beliefs as a researcher and how they influenced how you read the subject. So the researcher is very much the designer of the process and takes full responsibility for designing the process. And so these are sort of the two big traditions. And then you have, like, again, 100 to 150 years later, a critical approach that came into being because people were after a new sort of social science with new social laws that created this condition. Many people say that critical research began sort of in the 1930s around the Frankfurt School, and it is the sort of basic stance of critical research is that inquiry is always transformative, and it confronts the existing state of affairs and it tries to widen the grid of understanding through consciousness and through constructive action. So history, I would say, has a very, very important role here, because history is not just a sort of chronology of past events, but it's a set of values, and history is social, it's economic, it's political, it's cultural, it's ethnic, it's gender related, and you have this interplay of events and the power relations around them, and a rejection of what Jean-François Lyotard would have called the grand narrative, where you have this sort of this sort of overriding theory of everything, and it gradually undermines the institutional creation and distribution of knowledge as we know it. So critical pedagogy, which is what I talk about quite a lot in my sort of work, is it seeks to question that which is contained and that which is represented in received ideas. And these received ideas are usually the structures that dominate. So I've used all the right vocabulary to bring me to Paulo Freire now, who I have the obligatory 5 minutes for in all of my talks. So I could talk for hours on Paulo Freire and about all his contributions to education, but here I just want to weave in the idea of praxis, and a quote of his that I'm very fond of is that education is constantly remade in practice. Praxis, I misused the word. I saw Luke typing, I'm sure he's going to say something about that. Education is thus constantly remade in praxis, and in order to be, it must become. I wish I put a slide up for that. If somebody could just type my quote in the chat box so we have it. Education is constantly remade in praxis. In order to be, it must become. And this, for me, is the critical spirit at its most powerful, because it dissolves the line between being and becoming. And action research is precisely that. It is doing and being the change we want to see. So towards the end of the book, I've pretty much talked you through chapters 2, 3, and 5, by the way. So towards the end of the book, the authors talk about the interdependency of truth and action. Thank you, Maria, even though there was a little mistake. I made the same one as I was speaking. They talk about the interdependency of truth and action and how these exist in a sort of social matrix within which meanings are constructed and within which actions can be given meaning. And And they say very powerfully, and this is the final one I want to read out here, a quote directly from them: "Coming to me doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a process which takes place in and through history, even if only the history of a small group or only over a short period of time." So this is what I usually say when people ask me, well, action research is so context specific. How do we make sense of it in the wider landscape of research? And I would argue that everything is a text, everything has a place. And if you do a little bit of action research in your geographical location, in your discourse community, in your cultural group, and share it with people within that, you will slowly have an overlap of stories, and they're all stories, they're all worth contributing. So in chapter 5, which is the penultimate chapter of the book, the authors sum up the conversation around the complexities of research by repositioning action research as having two essential aims. And they keep it very simple. It is to improve and to involve. And there are three areas that action research seeks to improve. The first is practice, so your professional practice. The second is the understanding of practice by practitioners. And the third is to improve the situation in which practice takes place. You can immediately identify the key word here. It's all about what happens in the classroom. Involvement stands shoulder to shoulder with improvement, they say. So I've done an awful lot of talking, about half an hour, on the mindset with which we approach research. And I don't expect you to respond immediately because I realize it's quite a lot to take in. And also the criteria that deems research worthwhile and important in different contexts under different lenses. So I think there's, hopefully this will help sort of you go away and read further on defining your parameters of what is involved in your research mindset. And if I had to boil everything I'd said in the last 40 minutes down to one word, it would be restlessness. An action researcher, I think, is always dissatisfied with a surface interpretation of things. A researcher always wants to know more and to dig deeper and to learn harder. And this permanent restlessness is what comes into practice and what creates the energy to reviving practice and making it better. So what I'd like to do now is go through a very brief checklist of sorts. This is homemade by me, not from the book. And I'm hoping you'll volunteer some ideas along the way to help shape the conversation. So what I wanted to say as well, did I put that slide here, Chuck? No, I put it at the end, okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, if I could just go back to my spiral slide. This is it, right? Action research involves a system of planning, acting, observing, reflecting, and then re-planning again, acting, observing, reflecting, and the same again, depending on how long you want to carry on. Most of us are constrained by the length of a normal academic year, I realize. So I recommend a lot of clarity with these 4 stages. And again, you know, I think you need a lot of clarity in your thinking, in your writing, in your reporting, but also I think at this stage, you need a lot of clarity in the reading. And at this stage, there's something that happens that's called Reconnaissance, or where you go away and you find facts to support your initial thinking around an idea. So at this stage of the process, so right at the center of this diagram, you locate an idea in its theoretical context and understand what else has been written about it. And so you do a lot of reading at this stage and you try to understand it from that perspective. So the next one I'd like to say is that knowledge is, all research is about knowledge generation. And the knowledge that action research generates is very emergent, and the inquiry process is continuous. When I do action research, I very rarely sit as an observer at the back of the classroom and have plenty of time to write everything down. I'm always very much in the middle of things doing it. So you need to stay close to your purpose once you're in the process, and sort of remind yourself of what you're looking for and why you're there from start to end. And also, you don't really need a hypothesis with action research. What you really need is a plan, because from the plan will come your research agenda. And within this, you have to also know what your research question is. What is your purpose for doing the research? Has that purpose been clearly articulated? Action research is not a research method where you go in not knowing why you're going in. There are other methods like that. Grounded theory, for example, is one of those methods where you go in and you collect a lot of data, and the questions sort of emerge from the data. Action research is a very crystal clear type of research in that way, and you have a purpose at the beginning, you articulate it very clearly, you go in with your plan, and you take it from there. Data is important, and it's very important to document data and to figure out all the nitty-gritty as to how you're going to document data, because this is where I've personally slipped up in the past and where I've struggled a little bit with keeping track of things. So if you're going to use multiple ways of recording data, like video and maybe audio recording and notes and interviews and these sorts of things, you need to plan all that out at the beginning, and you need to have your tools very easily available. And so, next. Okay, so this is my final slide. Just on the data slide, I also wanted to talk about the phases. When you're in the acting phase and the observing phase, I think it's probably the most overwhelming point in the research, because it's when you've put your plan into action and you're kind of doing whatever change you're doing with your students. And you need to be quite organized about how you document. So you have your tools ready at the beginning. Be pretty organized about how you document phases 2 and 3. And even though what I've noticed in the past is I go through the motions in phases 2 and 3, and I don't necessarily document everything because it's part of my normal context, and I take it for granted that I'll remember, but I don't always remember. And with a little bit of research I did last year, I was slightly extra disciplined about writing in my journal at the end of every single sort of research event. And I found that it helped an awful lot, because you don't see everything actually, and you don't remember anything, and you need to cast your thoughts in a very, very systematic way. And finally, just a little bit of advice, back to what I said at the very beginning, problems aren't pathologies. Pathologies imply the sort of causes and effects of disease, and classrooms really aren't infested with anything. They're just the human condition working towards better human conditions. So now I'd like to just say, given that research is systematic inquiry made public, how will you systematize your inquiry? And we here at iTDi will help you make it public. Chuck and I have been having a conversation about this. If you want to weigh in, Chuck, we would be happy sort of early next year to offer a little bit of support for people interested in doing action research. It's all still at the planning stage, but I'll let Chuck weigh in on that, because I'll be doing, yes, that's a great link, by the way, from Infed and Plymouth, etc. I haven't been monitoring the chat box enough. So let me just go down. I'm going to really enjoy reading this chat box at the end. I'm afraid I've been a bit absorbed in the slides. This is my penultimate quote, and I have a question after this quote. Education is a practice sustained in society by the institution of schooling, and therefore is always vulnerable to the acquisitiveness and the competitiveness of schooling as an institution. Thus, there is a permanent tension between education and schooling, which requires teachers and others to maintain, sorry for my typo, a critical vigilance about the extent to which schooling is undermining rather than sustaining the values definitive of educational practices. It's a very beautiful, very dense, I realize, quote from the book, but hopefully all this will be available to you afterwards. This is my question. Do you perceive a tension between schooling and education. Yes, I do too, and that's why I'm an action researcher, I would say. So I think this is a good way to take the conversation further, and hopefully all these slides will be available to you. Please forgive the typo in the preceding quote. And you can, yes. Oh, Shreya, I don't think it's just in India, seriously. My second and final quote is, I'll steam and then we can chat at the end. The problems of education are not simply problems of achieving known ends. They are problems of acting educationally in social situations, which typically involve competing values and complex interactions between different people who are acting on different understandings of their common situation and on the basis of different values about how interaction should be conducted. So again, a pretty dense quote, but this is really quite inevitable with academic presentations. This is my question related to that quote. What are the layers of interaction that you manage in your practice? And do they have different sets of values? I'm aware that not everybody might want to share this in a chat box. So, feel free to just think about this and articulate it elsewhere sometime. Write to me, write a blog post, or anything like that. Yes, so I'm nearing the end. I'm in fact at the end, but I'd really like to chat in the chat box because I haven't had time to do that. And this is my final slide. The change I'd like to see is, and I think this is a good starting point for action research. Any questions, any comments? Chuck and Jason, do you want to weigh in and chat with us? Or
I'm here, and things are going great. I think I'll just sort of sit in the back and let people.
I'm seeing so many links that I didn't get to click on them. Yeah.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
If people would just like to take some time
Oh,
and
thank you
ask,
for being here.
ask
Yeah,
you some
there's a lot.
questions,
I know,
or
I know. I think I realize it's pretty dense. But yeah.
no,
Yeah.
there's certainly a lot to think about. I'm
I'm
sure that people
very
do have
happy
some
to chat
questions
now. I
and
saw so many
comments.
great links being posted. Yeah.
The change I'd like to see, one of them, is just more great presentations like the one that you just did, and then people taking these ideas further and really getting involved in action research.
Yes. Yeah.
Brian says he's currently carrying out a project for his thesis. That's interesting.
Oh, great. Wow. I sensed that there were a lot of experienced people in the audience because I saw all these links that I use very regularly. And thank you, Judy. Very kind. Thank you so much. What's Mark Twain? I'm seeing Mark Twain's name crop up. I haven't really followed that one. Thank you, Tatiana. It was very nice to have you here. I'll have this chat box one.
Yes, you will.
It's not going to just disappear.
No. We'll be
Yes,
saving.
okay.
We'll be saving the chat boxes.
All right.
You'll be getting it as a PDF.
Right. No question is ever silly, Laura. Please don't worry. So, Chuck, what would you do with $1 billion for teacher training? You know,
I can't even imagine. You know, it's just. I fight for $50.
Yeah.
$1 billion.
Should the results represent two different projects? How accurate is it to combine data? It depends on the classroom, I would say, Laura. I've done a co-research thing with a colleague of mine, but we were teaching the same class. So I would say that if your basic plan was for your own respective classes, then it's two projects because you don't know how people are going to respond and what's But in the write-up, you could probably do something very creative and talk about, in this institution, two sets of people worked on this, and these are the changes that they saw, and so forth. But I think it's very much the people, the participants of the research, that define the size and boundaries of the project. So, yeah, I agree, Hannah. I think that would be super interesting, and if I had someone at work who was willing to do that in tandem like that, it would be great.
Wonderful presentation, Divya.
Different students, same class. Okay. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for all the help. Sorry about the tech fail at the beginning.
No. If you hadn't mentioned
Firefox wasn't in a good mood.
I wouldn't have remembered
it. Great.
A wonderful small presentation. Yeah, very nice job. I'm going to be rewatching this presentation. Some more time in it.
Thank you, Mark. I was hoping to pitch it to different people, and I hope those of you who are experienced action researchers weren't too bored. It was fun.
Yeah, as Divya mentioned, we've been talking about how can iTDi and gallery teachers support teachers who are doing action research. And one of the things that's happening is Divya is doing a column for gallery teachers, which is going to launch on September 1st. It's all about critical pedagogy and action research. I've seen the first column. It's just so there's one area where there's some more coming out. And maybe there's an iTDi blog issue in the
I imagine a lot. I imagine a lot can happen in a space like this, an online classroom, as far as workshops, more going beyond and actually looking at what the teachers can do on their own with your support.
Yeah, no, it's
I know how busy you are, but I wonder if maybe sometime later in the year, maybe the winter intensive, or maybe as maybe a special feature of gallery teachers.
Did we talk about doing a course in April, May next year on this?
Yeah,
we did, right? Yeah. So that would be a good time of year for me. And if I'd be very happy to do that. And I think the most precious thing is to keep the conversation going. There is an action research MOOC. That's what I was hoping to do. Tyson, thank you. So yeah, I think those of you who were in the session today, Laura, if you sound like you might be interested in doing more action research, for example, please stay in touch with me, and let's see how we can take it all further, because that's what it's all about.
Fabulous.